Good evening, all. I thought we'd start off with a quick recap of these chapters, just updating the main threads. So Mr. Camperdown and the Diamonds and what happens with Lucy Morris at Fawn Court first, and then in Bruton Street with Lady Linlithgow, and a bit about what's happening at the Deanery in Bobsborough, Dean Greystock and family. Finish with Portray Castle, where Lizzie's having a hunting party. Then we'll have a look at some of the main characters and the dilemmas they face and decisions they have to make. Then I'll finish with a bit of historical context, which I hope will be useful or possibly redundant, in which case I apologize in advance. Right, Mr. Camperdown. Mr. Camperdown has called a meeting in his office to discuss further action about the diamonds. He's getting anxious about the necklace, afraid it'll be dismantled and sold before anything is done. John Eustace is quite laid back, good-natured, and anxious to avoid a quarrel. And Frank has suggested that Lizzie should give up the jewels till the legal issues are settled, but he personally supports her claim. And he tells Lord Fawn roundly that his conduct is ungentlemanly, and he informs them that the diamonds are still at Portray. That's the end of the meeting. Somewhat disappointed, Camperdown strolls down to the old square Lincoln's Inn to see Mr. Dove. Mr. Dove has also refused to leave London, even though it's summer, or near summer, to join his family in Ramsgate. The two have much in common. They're both dedicated to their work, almost idealistic about the mission. The outside world to them was a world of pretty, laughing, ignorant children, and lawyers were the parents, guardians, pastors, and masters by whom the children should be protected from the evils incident to their childishness. So Mr. Dove clarifies the 3 points again. The concept of heirlooms is not meant to protect mere property, but to preserve family history and chivalric associations. Paraphernalia is limited to what a woman would ordinarily wear and use, compatible with her income and standing. Valuable possessions cannot be gifted without some record, such as a mention in the will. And about mid-September, Camperdown finally files a bill in Chancery for the recovery of the jewels. Right. At Fawn Court, Lucy has twice accused Lord Fawn of untruth. It's an anomaly of Victorian times. Telling lies is a lesser offence than accusing someone of lying. Lord Fawn leaves in a huff, and Lady Fawn has a delicate balancing act to do. Lucy's only a governess, but she has a fiancé, and so she's now almost equal to the Fawn ladies. However, this promotion in status does not mean she can contradict or insult Lord Fawn, who is a man, head of the family, and an Under-Secretary of State. So Lucy should be scolded and banished to her room, but shouldn't be sent away altogether. But Lucy decides she cannot stay in these circumstances and writes to Frank, asking for suggestions. In the meantime, the Hitaways go to Scotland, and they stay at Dumfries, 20 miles from Portray, and from Gowran, Mrs. Hittaway hears all about the cousinly displays of affection between Frank and Lizzie. This information is relayed to Fawn Court, and then about the same time comes Lady Linlithgow's offer via Bobsborough. Lucy's quite ready to go to Lady Lynn, but Lady Fawn urges her to stay and even warns her about Frank and Lizzie and how her engagement may not come to fruition. But Lucy refuses to doubt Frank. However, in her letter to him, drops a little hint. Anyway, a preliminary visit is arranged to Lady Linlithgow, who is informed of Lucy's engagement, but not to whom. It's arranged that she is to start the following week, with the proviso that her suitor is not to call at Bruton Street. And before leaving Fawn Court, Lucy apologizes to Lord Fawn for her accusation, but doesn't retract it. Okay, and at Bobsborough, Frank's engagement causes great unhappiness at the deanery. The dean and his wife have nothing against Lucy, but they feel Frank must marry money. He's a true Greystock and a spendthrift. Lizzie would have been their choice, but she's now engaged to Lord Fawn. Mrs. Greystock compares the two girls. She favors Lizzie for her beauty and wealth, and for all her faults, there's no scandal attached to Lucy. She's young and can be molded. Then Frank arrives, updates them on Lizzie's disputed diamonds, the impending court case, and Lord Fawn's threat to break off the engagement. This gives them hope that Frank may marry Lizzie after all, if he gives up Lucy. They're torn between worldly prudence and the sanctity of a promise. Lucy's letter is received saying she must leave the Fawns. Frank and his sisters assume that Lucy will come to the deanery. Mrs. Greystock craftily insists that Lucy should go to Lady Linlithgow's, who's looking for a companion for 6 months. So letters go out to Lucy and Lady Lynn, proposing the arrangement, and we've already seen the outcome. Okay, so Lucy, on the day appointed, Lucy arrives at Bruton Street in the Fawn carriage with two of the, Okay, so Lucy arrives at Bruton Street with two of the girls in the Fawn carriage. This upsets Lady Linlithgow. What's wrong with public transport, the train? She can't afford to keep a carriage. Lucy will have to go about by cab. And just a bit of context, the London South Western Railway started in 1838. Richmond Station, which is where Fawn Court is, Richmond, the station opened in 1846, offering a service to Waterloo. And in 1869, the route via Clapham Junction became available. So that's about the time the novel is set, I think, in the late 1860s or 70s. Anyway, Lucy assures her she can use London cabs, and these were horse-drawn hackney cabs with regulated fares by then. And she's told that she has no duties except to be punctual at mealtimes, 9 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 7 o'clock, bedtime, 10:30. She hears all about her employer's lumbago, gout, and temper. And in the course of some gossip about Frank and Lizzie, Lucy is provoked into revealing the identity of her fiancé. Now Lady Linlithgow gets the whole picture. She guesses at the motives of Mrs. Greystock and writes a really spiteful letter to her. Meanwhile, at Portray, Lizzie has guests. It's her first big house party. John Eustace, her brother-in-law, mainly out of courtesy, comes for a couple of days, is happy to see little Florian, but is uncomfortable with her friends. Frank agrees to come for a week from the 5th of November, and the rest of the party are all from London. So let's meet them because they'll play a big part in future developments. There's Joseph Emilius, an eloquent Hungarian preacher, popular with the ladies, uncertain marital status. Mrs. Carbuncle, in her 40s, birth and origins a mystery. She's married, but her husband is seldom seen or spoken of. She's not rich, but moves in London society, keeps a carriage, owns horses and hunts. Bold and audacious in dress and manner. Then Lucinda Roanoke, her niece, 18, born and bred in the US, has spent 9 months in Paris and a year in London. Stunningly beautiful, she's had her portrait hung at the summer exhibition, presumably at the Royal Academy. She's handsome, arrogant, despises the company, is fearless and very keen on hunting. Lord George de Bruce Carruthers is 45 years, mysterious, dashing, adventurous, is the brother of the recently promoted Marquis of Killiecrankie. He has a room in London, dines at his club, is seen everywhere. Could he be Lizzie's corsair? We'll see. Finally, Sir Griffin Tewett, young and stupid, nominally rich, but with a rundown, mismanaged estate tied up in lawsuits, is vicious, unamiable, in love with Lucinda, and determined to marry and possess her. Okay, if you'll permit me, I'll say a bit about the actual hunting. Horses played a big part in Trollope's life. He started hunting in Ireland and loved it despite his lack of money, physique, and natural ability. He managed to combine it with his post office work in Ireland and then in England. And even when he started writing and moved to Waltham Cross to be within reach of London, he continued to hunt with the Essex and Leighton Buzzard hunts. Right to the end, his son tells us, he keeps at least 2 horses. His novels are full of hunting scenes, and he talks about it at length in his autobiography as well. And the other reason for talking about the hunting is that those days set the scene for the development of the plot and the interrelationships between the characters. So Lizzie has bought 2 horses, has practiced her riding skills. She's getting a bit worried about the cost of it all. The horses, cows, hay, food and drink for the guests. And she's also a bit nervous about the hunting. She's never done that before. So there are plans to hunt on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Right, the Monday hunt is close by and is reachable by carriage and horse. For the first few minutes, Lizzie knows nobody and feels a bit left out. And then Lord George steps in and guides her smoothly through it all. 3 foxes are killed by the hounds, practically no riding. 1 is dug out from its hiding place. And then it starts to rain. They had to have lunch in a cattle shed. More of the same after lunch. 1 fox killed by the dogs, very little riding, then a wet ride home. Everybody in a bad temper. Lizzie is disillusioned. The hunt on Wednesday now. That involves a train journey to Kilmarnock and carriage to the hunt. Frank meets them on what he thinks is his hired horse from McFarlane's in Glasgow, but which is recognised by the old hands as belonging to a Mr. Nappy from Jamaica Road. Lizzie chooses to be guided by Sir George rather than Frank. It's getting interesting. They ride over hills, a bridge, fences, walls, etc. And Sir George begins to be impressed with Lizzie, her looks and courage, and also aware of her money. More interesting. Then comes the brook, where Lucinda falls in and has to be rescued with her horse. Sir Griffin escorts her to the inn and takes the opportunity to propose to her. She surlily declines to answer, saying she's too cold and wet. The hunt continues, the fox is caught, and Mr. Nappy arrives, furious, to reclaim his horse, will not listen to any explanations, will not of the misunderstanding. And this mix-up is very humorous, actually, and it's based on a real incident involving Trollope's friend, Charles Buxton. Back home, Lizzie is triumphant because she has been awarded the fox's brush as a trophy. Tempers improve after dinner and drinks, but Lizzie, she's still hedging her bets between Frank and Lord George, and so she has a few words in private with Frank before retiring. Another hunt on Saturday, but Frank stays home talking to Mr. Emilius, who's curious, very curious about Lizzie, her estate and finances. So it's getting even more interesting. The hunt is fairly uneventful, and urged on by her aunt, Lucinda accepts Sir Griffin when he repeats his proposal. This is witnessed by Lizzie and Mrs. Carbuncle, later confirmed between aunt and niece, then aunt and fiancé, announced to Lord George and Frank in the evening. Useful advice from Lord George: get it done quickly. Now, I'd like to say a word about Andy Gowran before we leave Portray. He's bad-tempered, dour and cross, a man of few words, suffers from lumbago. He's almost feudal in his loyalty to the Eustace family and estate, quite common in those days. But why does he hate Lizzie? because he doesn't regard her as a true lady, or because she's not a Eustace, or does he think she's milking the property? But he's still very conscientious, sees to the cows, horses, hay and oats, and earns his wages. And give him his dues. I had no problem with his accent. It's all a question of reading it aloud, pronouncing it as it's spelt, and you'll get the sense of it. One gets the sense of it very quickly. Just give you a couple of lines, for instance. Ne doute, she'll do with her ain what pleases her ain self. The mair ye pour out, the less there be left in. Mr. John coming, I'll be glad then to see Mr. John. Who I, 8, there be 8 enough. Another coup, we'll want 2 either coups. I'll see to the coups. You soon get used to it. I had similar problems with the Grapes of Wrath when I was reading it some years ago. Right, so now that we've just had a recap of the chapters, let's focus on Frank, Lizzie and Lucinda and the choices, the circumstances, the situation they're in and the choices facing them. Frank's predicament. Frank is Lizzie's cousin, the only relative she can rely on. He feels he should support her in her problems with Lord Fawn and Camperdown and help her with her new responsibilities at Portray. So he supervises Gowran's maintenance work, discusses her house guests, arrangements for food, drink, and so on. And despite the intimacy that develops between them, he's still determined to marry Lucy. Lizzie does her best to stop that. She makes catty remarks about Lucy, which he discourages. She claims that she only accepted Lord Fawn out of pique and confesses her love for him. He doesn't respond and leaves for Bobsborough, vowing to be true to her. To Lucy, I mean. He's torn 2 ways. He knows where his duty lies and also that Lucy has character and integrity which Lizzie lacks. But he sees in Lizzie a beautiful, vulnerable woman. Her act of offering herself to him is seen not as unladylike, as most people would say in those days, but as evidence of her good taste. Then the family pressures, his own political, professional, and social ambitions all tell him he must marry money. He argues that his letter proposing to Lucy was written in a hurry before he knew his own mind. So would it be right to marry her only to make her share his poverty and misery? Then comes her letter from Fawn Court expressing full confidence and trust in him. Now, if he were a true scoundrel, he could abandon her and choose prosperity with Lizzie, but he's not, and hence the dilemma. Then comes Lady Linlithgow's spiteful letter, further pressure from his parents. He mutters something must be settled, but still goes to Portray to hunt. Lizzie, now, feeling vulnerable and in her widowed state, with Camperdown at her heels, she accepts Lord Fawn, looking for respectability and social status. He's satisfied with the bargain, her wealth in return for his status. Then he learns of the diamonds and possible scandal, talks of breaking off the engagement. Is he afraid of doing wrong or thought to be doing wrong? Anyway, Lizzie too is disenchanted with him and will drop him if she can be sure of Frank. But she wants revenge first, to humiliate him for rejecting her. But having given up the idea of marrying Lord Fawn, she settles for Frank. But even he is not quite her ideal beau. It's too conventional, not romantic and dashing enough like Byron's Corsair. She hedges her bets and uses all her wiles to try and lure him away from Lucy, but no concrete results so far. Then Lord George appears on the scene. Wild, mysterious, could he be her Corsair? The hunting experience raises his stock with her, but she's still a bit cautious about his finances and whether he might not already have a Medora secreted on some Greek island. So whom will she marry in the end? We have Lucinda and Sir Griffin. Sir Griffin wants to marry Lucinda, is determined to possess her. tries to woo her with compliments with little encouragement. After the first hunt, Mrs. Carbuncle warns her niece that she ought to make certain of him before her money runs out. Lucinda cannot bring herself to love him, finds him physically repulsive. He proposes after her fall in the brook, but she refuses to answer, saying that she's too wet and cold. That makes Sir Griffin more determined than ever. He plans to take his revenge after he's got possession of her. There's a sort of hatred mixed with his love, rather like a hunter for his fox. Then Mrs. Carbuncle again urges her niece. The money's running out fast. And when Sir Griffin proposes again, she accepts him, but with such reluctance and bad grace that even he's worried. Do you really love me? He asks repeatedly. There will be trouble ahead. Then, Lord George. Lizzie's possible suitors to date have both been conventional gentlemen. Lord Fawn, a meek and mild Liberal, Frank, a true blue Tory. Then comes Lord George, a mysterious character from London. His politics are suspect. He has the reputation of being a radical, a Republican, even a Fenian, and a volunteer rifleman. Now, why do these appellations make him seem so wicked and dangerous? It's got something to do with the political instability in Europe at the time. Remember, in France, Austria, Hungary, and Spain, following on from the Napoleonic Wars, and which set it all off. Then there was disquiet among the English upper classes as well, in case the unrest spread to Britain. So the radicals supported electoral reform, freedom of the press, lower taxes, nothing too outrageous. There was a loose parliamentary grouping, Whigs and a subset of Tories working towards electoral reform and other changes. Then there were the more extreme splinter groups outside who sometimes resorted to violence, hence the fear and suspicion with which they were regarded among certain classes. Republicans were essentially anti-monarchy. Such sentiments began to be voiced after the French Revolution and caused great anxiety among the upper classes. However, they were generally peaceful, limited to articles in newspapers voicing concern over the expense involved in maintaining the monarchy. They wanted this monarchy replaced by a republic, but without bloodshed. But even that was too much for those times. The Fenians included, they were an umbrella term for several secret organizations in UK, Canada, and the US, fighting for a free island. Yet regarded with horror and loathing in English society. Were they terrorists or freedom fighters? Depends on your point of view, I guess. And finally, he was also reputed to be a rifleman. Now, who were these volunteer riflemen? During the late 1850s, there was growing fear of war with France. There was, after the attempt to assassinate Napoleon III in 1858, it was thought that the bomb used was manufactured in England, and some French officers called for an invasion of Britain. So there was a need for, it was felt there was a need for a volunteer force to support the regular army. And in May 1859, the government sanctioned the formation of a volunteer corps. The National Rifle Association was formed in late 1859. Its aims including the encouragement of volunteer rifle corps and the promotion of rifle shooting throughout Great Britain. Frightening thought. The NRA held their first rifle meeting on Wimbledon Common in 1860 with royal patronage. Local and regional rifle matches became commonplace, and by the end of the 1860s, Great Britain had thousands of trained riflemen. Military reviews were popular, where the men demonstrated their skills to the public. Among them, Lord George and Bruce Carruthers. Finally, who were the corsairs? They were foreign privateers, that is, state-sponsored pirates rather than the free-for-all pirates. The Barbary pirates who terrorized the Mediterranean from the 14th to the 19th centuries, and they were referred to as corsairs because they didn't attack Muslim ships. Later on, French privateers were also referred to by the English as corsairs, and it's a very negative term. The poem by Byron, it tells the story of corsair Conrad, leaves his distraught wife Medora in his Aegean island, sails off to attack Pasha Said. He succeeds, but gallantly trying to help the women in the harem escape, he gives the Pasha a chance to counterattack. His life is in danger, but he's saved by a slave, Gulnara, who offers him a knife to kill the Pasha. But Conrad, of course, refuses to kill him in cold blood without a fair fight. Exasperated, Gulnara kills the Pasha herself. They both flee to his island, discover that Medora has died from grief. Conrad then, most inexplicably, leaves the island and Gulnara. So it concludes, he left a corsair's name to other times, linked with one virtue and 1,000 crimes. And this is just the sort of thing that appeals to Lizzie's romantic temperament. So does Lord George fit the bill? Whom will she marry in the end? Read on. Thank you.